The sound of the bucket hitting the bottom of the well was a dry, hollow thud. It was the sound of the end of things. My Lin stood under the relentless glare of the Nevada sun, the rope limp in her calloused hands. Dust, fine as flour, coated her worn trousers and the sleeves of her husband's old work shirt. For the third day in a row, the well had given up nothing but echoes. The air was thick with heat, shimmering over the cracked earth of the yard. Even the cicadas seemed to have surrendered, their buzzing drone replaced by a heavy, waiting silence. This ranch, her husband Chen's dream, was dying of thirst. The 24 cattle she had left were gaunt, their heads low, their movements sluggish. The small vegetable garden behind the clapboard house was a graveyard of withered stalks. Chen had bought this parcel with every dollar he'd saved from 10 years of laying track for the railroad, his hands split and his back bent. He had seen life in this valley, a future for them carved out of the sagebrush and rock. But an accident with a wild horse a year ago had taken him, leaving My Lin with a deed, a mountain of work, and the quiet, persistent judgment of their neighbors in the town of Redemption, 10 miles east. A Chinese woman, alone, running a ranch. It was an affront to some, a curiosity to others, and a target for men like Arthur Sterling. A flicker of movement at the edge of her property drew her eye. A man was staggering along the dusty track that served as a road, a shape slung over his shoulder. He was a silhouette against the blinding sky, wavering in the heat. My Lin's hand went instinctively to the small of her back, where the handle of a skinning knife rested in its sheath. Strangers were rarely good news. She stood her ground, watching as he drew closer, his steps uneven, his focus fixed on her small house as if it were a mirage. When he was 50 yards away, she could see the desperation etched into his face, a mask of dust and sweat. He was tall and lean, dressed in the faded denim and worn leather of a drifting cowboy. But it was the bundle he carried that held her attention. It was a dog, a golden-colored retriever, its body limp, its head lolling with each pained step the man took. He stumbled to a halt before her, his chest heaving. He didn't seem to have the breath for greetings. "Water," he rasped, his eyes pleading. "Please. For my dog." He gently lowered the animal to the ground. The dog was fully grown, but its coat was matted and dull, its ribs stark beneath the fur. It tried to lift its head, but managed only a weak twitch of its tail before collapsing again with a soft whine. My Lin looked from the suffering animal to her dry well. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. "The well is dry," she said, her voice flat. It was the only truth she had to offer. The man's shoulders slumped, the last bit of his strength seeming to drain away. He knelt beside the dog, his hand stroking its flank. "He needs more than water now," he said, his voice cracking. "He's got a fever. Hasn't kept anything down. I heard there was a cow here. Milk. He needs milk. Just a little. A cow." She had one milking cow left, Bessie, who was herself struggling with the lack of good forage and water. What little milk she gave was precious, a vital part of My Lin's own meager diet. Giving it away felt like giving away a piece of her own survival. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the hope that a woman's heart would be softer than a man's. She had learned long ago that softness was a luxury she could not afford. "I have nothing to spare for a stranger's dog," she said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw the full measure of his exhaustion. His eyes were a startlingly clear blue, framed by sun-bleached lashes. There was no anger in them, only a profound and weary sorrow. "I'm not asking for charity," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I'm a worker. I can see your fences need mending. Your corral gate is hanging by one hinge. And that well, a dry well, can sometimes be deepened. I can work. You give my dog milk, I'll fix your ranch." My Lin almost laughed. It was the most ridiculous proposal she had ever heard. This half-dead man, with his dying dog, was offering to save a place that was already lost. He looked as if a strong breeze could knock him over. But then she looked at the dog again, its shallow breath stirring the dust. She thought of Chen, how he had loved this land with a fierceness that had baffled her at first, how he would have given his last drop of water to a creature in need. She looked at the sagging porch of her house, the splintered rails of the fence, the silent, mocking well. What did she have left to lose? She let out a long, slow breath, the hot air burning her lungs. "Bring him into the shade of the porch," she said, turning toward the small barn without waiting for his reply. "I'll get the milk." The man, who later told her his name was Luke, drank 2 full dippers of water from her cistern before he seemed to revive. He watched with an intensity that bordered on prayer as My Lin knelt and patiently coaxed a few drops of the warm milk into the dog's mouth using a clean rag. The dog, Buddy, swallowed weakly. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. For the rest of the day, Luke sat with Buddy on the porch, offering him milk and water every hour while his own strength slowly returned. He spoke little, but his gratitude was a quiet, constant presence. By the next morning, a change had occurred. The dog was able to lift its head and lap at the milk from a shallow bowl. And Luke was on his feet, his movements still stiff but filled with a new purpose. He didn't ask where the tools were, he found them in the dilapidated shed. He started with the corral gate, his hands, though blistered, moving with an economy and skill that surprised her. He found a length of scrap iron to brace the post, reset the hinges, and had the gate swinging smoothly by noon. He worked through the heat of the day, speaking only to ask for water or to give her a brief report on Buddy's condition. My Lin watched him from the kitchen window as she kneaded dough for bread. He moved like a man who understood the language of wood and wire, of stress and balance. He wasn't just patching things, he was making them right, stronger than they had been before. She had grown so used to the sight of decay that the sight of repair was jarring. It stirred a feeling she had long since buried. It felt dangerously like hope. On the 3rd day, Arthur Sterling paid a visit. He rode a magnificent black stallion that was a stark contrast to the parched landscape, and his clothes were clean, his boots polished. Sterling owned the sprawling ranch to the north, a vast empire of cattle and water rights. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, and he had made it clear since Chen's death that he wanted her land. He dismounted and approached the porch, his eye sweeping over her property with a dismissive air. He ignored Luke, who was replacing a rotted section of fence near the barn, and addressed My Lin as if she were a child. "Lin," he said, his smile thin and practiced. "The heat is getting worse. This is no place for a woman on her own. I'm prepared to renew my offer. It's a generous one, considering the state of things." "The ranch is not for sale, Mr. Sterling," My Lin said, her voice steady. She hated the way he used a shortened version of her name, as if he couldn't be bothered to pronounce the whole thing. Sterling's eyes flickered toward Luke, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "You've hired help? I wouldn't have thought you could afford it." The implication was clear, she was mismanaging her resources. Before she could answer, Luke walked over, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. He moved without aggression, but he positioned himself slightly in front of My Lin. He didn't look at Sterling, but at the ground near the man's expensive boots. "The well's gone dry," Luke said, his voice calm. "But the ground feels hollow about 20 feet down. Could be a secondary aquifer if a man was willing to dig." Sterling finally deigned to look at him. "And who are you?" "Just a man fixing a fence," Luke said, meeting his gaze. The challenge in the simple statement was unmistakable. Sterling's smile tightened. He was a man who dealt in power and control, and this quiet drifter was an unexpected variable. He looked back at My Lin, his voice dropping to a confidential, condescending tone. "Don't be foolish. This land will break you. My offer is your only way out. Think on it." He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a thick silence in his wake. My Lin felt a tremor of fear. Sterling wasn't a man who made idle threats. He saw her ranch not as a home, but as a piece on a map, a square that would complete his collection. That evening, the air cooled slightly, and a sliver of moon rose in the purple sky. Buddy was walking, albeit unsteadily, sniffing around the porch steps. Luke was examining the well, lowering a weighted line down its stone-lined throat. "He's right about one thing, Luke said without turning around. "This land will break you if you let it." "I'm not letting it," she replied, her voice sharper than she intended. He turned then, his face shadowed in the twilight. "I know. But you can't fight a man like that with just stubbornness. He uses rules you don't even know exist." He paused, coiling the rope. "That well isn't just dry from the heat. The stone lining is cracked near the bottom. It's been leaking water into the bedrock for months, maybe longer. That's why it gave out so fast." She stared at him. Chen had complained the well seemed to need more and more work, but they'd thought it was just the age of it. No one had ever mentioned a crack. "How do you know that?" she asked. "I've seen it before," he said vaguely, turning his attention back to the well. "Up in the silver mines." "Same geology?" The answer hung in the air between them, another piece of a puzzle she couldn't yet see. A drifter who understood fence mending was one thing. A drifter who understood geology and mine shafts was something else entirely. She did not yet know that the knowledge of stone and water was not the only secret he carried. The next week passed in a rhythm of hard work. Luke was determined to tackle the well. It was a formidable task. He rigged a pulley system to the crossbeam and began the slow, grueling process of lowering himself into the darkness to inspect the damage firsthand. Mai Lin would work the rope, her arms and back aching with the strain, her anxiety a knot in her stomach every time he disappeared below ground. He would emerge hours later, covered in grime and sweat, with detailed reports of the cracks and the crumbling mortar. He explained his plan in the evenings, sketching diagrams in the dirt with a stick. He needed to seal the cracks, which required a specific mixture of clay and sand he'd seen used before. Then, he believed he could dig deeper, past the collapsed section, to tap into the lower water table he was so certain existed. It was a gamble, a massive expenditure of energy with no guarantee of success. But watching him work, seeing the quiet confidence in his hands, Mai Lin found herself believing it was possible. Their shared labor created a new kind of language between them. They spoke of leverage and fulcrums, of the weather, of Buddy's steady improvement. The dog was now his old self, a constant, happy shadow at Luke's heels. One evening, as Mai Lin was stitching a tear in Luke's shirt, he finally spoke of something other than work. He was sitting on the porch steps, idly stroking Buddy's ears. The dog rested its head on his lap with a contented sigh. "This was my brother's dog," Luke said, his voice soft. "His name was Sam." Mai Lin stopped sewing, her needle poised in midair. "Sam was younger than me. Full of big ideas. He went to work on the railroad, just like your husband did. He saved his money, wanted to buy a piece of land himself. He got this dog," said a man with a ranch needed a good dog. Luke's voice grew thick. "There was a cave-in, in one of the tunnels they were blasting. Sam, he didn't make it out. I was working 100 miles away at the time. All they sent me was his last pay and a letter telling me where to find his dog. Buddy is all I have left of him." He held up the dog's collar. It was plain, worn leather, the buckle tarnished. This was the only thing in his pocket. He'd just bought it. The simple object seemed to hold the weight of all his loss. Mai Lin felt a powerful ache of recognition. She thought of the small, carved box where she kept Chen's letters, the paper softened and creased from countless readings. She understood, in that moment, the fierce, protective love Luke had for this animal. It wasn't just a dog, it was a promise. "My husband, Chen, believed this land was a promise, too," she said quietly. "He said the earth doesn't care what you look like, only what you're willing to give it. He thought he could build a life here where we would be judged by our work, not our faces." She looked out at the dark expanse of the valley. "He was a good man. He didn't deserve to die so young." A comfortable silence settled between them, a shared understanding of grief that needed no more words. The distance that had separated the desperate stranger and the wary widow had vanished. They were two people, bound by loss and a shared, stubborn refusal to surrender. The next day, their fragile peace was shattered. Arthur Sterling returned, and this time he brought two men with him. One was his foreman, a burly man with a cruel set to his mouth. The other was a man in a dusty suit who introduced himself as a representative from the Territorial Land Office. Sterling didn't bother with pleasantries. He unrolled a document with an official-looking seal. "I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news, Lynn," he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "It seems your late husband's claim on this parcel was never properly finalized. A clerical error, I'm sure. According to this survey, his eastern boundary was misrecorded. The section with the well, it actually falls on my property." My Lynn's blood ran cold. It was impossible. Chen had been meticulous. He had spent weeks in the territorial capital making sure every piece of paper was correct. "That's a lie," she said, her voice shaking. The man in the suit cleared his throat. "The documents are quite clear. Mr. Sterling has a senior claim to the water rights in this sector. Technically, you've been trespassing to use this well." Luke, who had just emerged from the well, his face smeared with mud, stepped forward. "Let me see that paper." Sterling's foreman moved to block him, but Sterling waved him off with a smug smile. "By all means. Let the hired hand have a look." Luke took the document, his eye scanning the lines of text and the hand-drawn map. He was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. My Lynn's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was how Sterling would win. Not with force, but with a piece of paper, a lie wrapped in the authority of the law. Finally, Luke handed the document back. He looked not at Sterling, but at the man from the land office. "You're new to this territory, aren't you?" The man blinked, taken aback. "I don't see what that has to do with." "The territorial surveyor is a man named Marcus Thorne," Luke said, his voice level and hard as granite. "He signs every official deed and survey. Has for the past 15 years. His signature has a broken cross on the T. It's famous. That signature there," he pointed a dirt-caked finger at the paper, "is a forgery. And not a very good 1-inch. The suited man's face went pale. Sterling's smile faltered. Furthermore, Luke continued, his gaze shifting to Sterling, the 1862 Homestead Act grants water rights with the land claim, especially for a primary residence well. A senior claim can't just erase that, not without a hearing in front of a federal judge. You're not just lying, Sterling. You're committing fraud." A stunned silence fell over the yard. Sterling stared at Luke, his mask of civility finally cracking to reveal the raw fury beneath. He had expected a frightened woman and an ignorant drifter. He had not expected this. "You have 24 hours to get off this property," Sterling snarled at Luke. "And as for you," he turned to my Lynn, his voice venomous, "you will regret this." They mounted their horses and galloped away, leaving my Lynn and Luke standing in the dust, the fraudulent threat still hanging in the air. My Lynn was trembling, a mixture of terror and awe coursing through her. She looked at Luke, at the man who had appeared at her doorstep on the verge of death, and saw him clearly for the first time. "Who are you?" she whispered. Luke finally looked at her, a wry, tired smile touching his lips. "My name is Luke. My brother's name was Sam. And our father was a lawyer for the Union Pacific Railroad." 3 months later, the autumn air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of sage and damp earth. The change in the ranch was breathtaking. The fences were taut, the barn roof was patched, and a small herd of healthy cattle grazed in a pasture that now had patches of green, fed by the miracle of the well. Luke had been right. After sealing the cracks, he had dug another 10 feet, blasting through a shelf of rock with carefully placed charges of dynamite he had purchased in town. One morning, the hollow thud of his pickaxe had been replaced by a wet, sucking sound. By evening, 10 feet of clear, cold water stood in the bottom of the well. It felt like a resurrection. The victory over the well was matched by the victory over Sterling. True to his word, Sterling had tried to file a legal challenge. But Luke had taken the small amount of money he had and ridden to the capital. He hadn't needed a lawyer. He had presented my Lynn's original deed, pointed out the discrepancies in Sterling's claim, and filed a formal complaint about the forged document and the impersonation of a land office official. A U.S. Marshal was now investigating Arthur Sterling's business dealings. His power, built on bullying and deceit, was beginning to crumble. My Lynn stood on the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. Luke was finishing repairs on a harness, his hands moving with the same steady competence she had come to rely on. Buddy lay at his feet, occasionally thumping his tail against the wooden planks. They had fallen into a partnership that felt as natural as breathing. He never presumed, and she never demanded. They worked side by side, rebuilding Chen's dream, transforming it into something new, something that belonged to them both. He finished his work and came to stand beside her, looking out at the land as the sun set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and violet. The water trough near the barn was full, its surface reflecting the vibrant colors. It was a simple thing, a trough full of water, but to my Lynn, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for. Chen would have liked you, she said softly. He admired men who were good with their hands, but he respected men who were good with their heads more. Luke was quiet for a moment. My father wanted me and Sam to be lawyers like him. I hated it. All those books and papers. I wanted to be outside, to build things. Sam was the one who was supposed to do all the smart thinking. He reached down and scratched Buddy behind the ears. Funny how things turn out. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. The future was still uncertain. Life in this territory was never easy. But for the first time in a very long time, My Lynn did not feel alone. She had faced down drought and despair, greed and prejudice, and had found an unexpected strength within herself. Hope, she had learned, doesn't always arrive like a cavalry charge. Sometimes, it staggers to your door, half dead and leading a sick dog, and offers to fix what's broken in exchange for a little kindness. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.